For most of the offseason so far, when it comes to the Seattle Seahawks offense, the main question has been, who's going to run it? Well, now we know that Ryan Grubb in place as the offensive coordinator. And so now the question becomes, what is that offense going to look like? I'm going to tackle that question and all of those that come along with it with the outstanding Maddie Brown from across the pond, one of the co-hosts of the Seattle Overload podcast. We're going to look at that offensive scheme, how it might look different than what Grubb did in college, but also the same. We're going to tackle that question some people have about the middle of the field. What's the deal with that? And how his offense might fit the personnel on hand. Maddie Brown joining me next on Seahawks Forever.
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. I'm Dan. You can follow me on Twitter at Seahawks Forever. Hit that like button, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and don't forget to hit the bell so that you're notified of new episodes, of which lately there have been many, because there's a lot to talk about. If you prefer audio podcasts, the show is available on all audio platforms. Make sure and hit subscribe for all the same reasons. And if you want to hear episodes without ads in them, you can subscribe on Spotify for less than $1 a month. I'll put that link in the description. Or you can just buy me a coffee or a beer. That link will be down there as well. Thank you to all of you who've done that over the last week. Much appreciated. It never goes unnoticed by me or unappreciated that y'all take some time out of your day to watch or listen to this show and show its support and reach out to me with the nice things that you say. Very, very much appreciated. Always appreciated it as well when my guest today takes time to come on the show. We are, I don't know how many time zones apart. We are a half a world apart, but I always love chatting with Maddie. We were supposed to get together a couple weeks ago. It just didn't happen, but he made some time to come on the show. Last night, actually, is when this conversation went down. I'm recording this on Tuesday, the 20th. The Combine now just a week away. We have that to look forward to. And we can focus on personnel now. If you didn't catch my full live mock draft yesterday, please do so. Love to hear your comments and feedback on that. All right, let's get into this. Maddie and I caught up last night to talk offense, but I had to start off, of course, asking him about someone that he knows quite well, someone from his part of the country. So we had to talk a little bit of defense to begin with. Here's me and Maddie last night. First time catching up with Maddie Brown since all of the changes over at the VMAC. Joining me in the middle of the night, his time from across the pond in the UK, Maddie Brown of the Seattle Overload podcast. Thanks for joining me again.
Yeah, no problem, Dan. Fun to be on. I think last time I said that it was like a bold prediction last offseason that the Seahawks would have a top 5 run defense. And hey, if we cut it after like 8 weeks of the season, right, bang on. They had like the best run defense in the league. So, yeah, but a lot has happened since.
Yeah, after that Monday night game in New York, you were probably feeling pretty good about yourself there.
Yeah, I was like, damn, how about those one techniques? And yeah, that didn't continue.
Well, we can recycle that this year, and I'll just replay it. And then if it works out that way, then you come out looking the hero, right?
There you go.
So normally, I think in the past when you and I have talked, we've spent a lot of time talking about defense. But I had Griffin on fairly recently, right before the coaching change, and we did that. I'm curious about some of your thoughts on what's happening on the offensive side of the ball, or what we think might happen on the offensive side of the ball. But I cannot begin that conversation with you without first addressing Aden Durde, or Dirty. I got to get that right. Just when I thought I had it right, I've learned that I've been pronouncing it wrong. Aden Durde, the new defensive coordinator of your Seattle Seahawks, a countryman of yours, and also someone who preceded you in a current position that that has your name on it as well. Tell me just your initial thoughts when you saw the hire and what it means for people over there right now.
Yeah, well, technically, I don't ever think Durde called defensive plays at the London Olympians where I call plays. He actually did it for the London Warriors. I think it was the youth team where he was coaching, calling the plays there, the London Cobras. But he did play football for the London Olympians back in 2004 when I was 7 years old. So I don't know Durde. However, I do coach right now with people who coached Durde when he was a player, and he came in as a tight end. He played flag football, which is like his exposure to the sport. Came in as a tight end. They moved him to fullback. Then they were like, hang on a second, this guy's really, really physical, hardworking. Let's try and get him into NFL Europe, which was a thing at the time, of course. So they moved him to linebacker, and he ended up going to NFL Europe. But the guy I coach with, Rick Ayub, who's currently my defensive line coach, back then he was Durde's head coach and defensive coordinator. He said how he understands people. And while he never knew what players are going to achieve coming from the United Kingdom, it was clear Durde had the drive and love for the sport to break the kind of that ceiling, because it's so rare what Durde's done. I mean, personally, me, coaching the sport, being really interested in the tactics, but also just the coaching side and competing in that sense. It's inspirational how he's risen up the ranks, what he's done for growing the game in terms of the international player development, as well as just being really involved with the community. I know he had a business where he'd help before he ended up going to America, where he'd help kind of kids get into the sport. Rick also described to me how he'd challenge himself and others around him. And then Murray Dumas, who was the Olympians offensive coordinator back then, worked with him as a tight end, then a fullback, and is currently the head coach of the Olympians, my head coach right now. He said how he's a really great person, very straightforward, and you get what you see. And every time I listen to Durde just talk, he was on a great podcast, actually. It's a rugby podcast. I keep forgetting the name of it, which is terrible, but he did it back in July 2023. He's the same guy as in the press conference, and he spoke himself about the importance of consistency. But I think what Seattle's getting is the perfect candidate for. Yeah, he's not going to call plays initially, but him and Mike McDonald described how they view defensive football kind of similarly in certain senses. That might be quite abstract, because I think Durde's the perfect guy to kind of mold into that eventually being a play caller, but also look how he's risen up the ranks. He's clearly got something about him. I think just hearing him talk about football and his coaching style, in his press conference, in his radio interviews, but also on this podcast that I referenced, which I'm annoyed I'm blanking on the name of it.
You'll just blurt it out later if it comes to your mind.
Yeah, there you go.
We're informal here.
There you go. He's very, very consistent, and he seems really switched on to coaching, and his just passion for teaching players and getting to know players. And, he says how he had his chip on his shoulder in his radio interview. I mean, every time, right? And I'm slightly familiar with this, but every time, he opens his mouth, there's always the person who's making the hilarious joke that he has a British accent, which, he does. That is quite funny. I get it. But also, I have it on good authority that when he was in Carolina as a player, after NFL Europe, he was good enough to get spots with Atlanta and then Carolina on the practice squad. And in Carolina at training camp, fans were calling him a bum, like shouting stuff at him because he's from Britain, saying like he didn't belong there, all that type of stuff. So what's bizarre? He's been through so much to get to this point.
It's kind of like the inverse of Ted Lasso, a little bit.
There you go. Except
he has football experience.
right, and his personality is pretty different to Ted Lasso, I'd say. So anyway,
although he sure seemed comfortable in front of the microphone at that press conference. I thought it was interesting, and you touched on it, that he just, I don't know if you can see Butch causing havoc in the background there, but that's my cat.
No, I did not. Nice.
Something just fell off back there. Just heard. Probably picked up on the mic better than it did the camera. Just that, there were no connections there at all, really, other than, the Dan Quinn connection there and the information that John Schneider would have gotten when seeking out candidates. But I think it fits in with what we've seen from this coaching staff overall, is it? And part of that was born out of necessity, because they hired Mike McDonald so late in the process. A lot of guys that maybe would have been on their radar for coordinator and assistant jobs were snapped up. and had taken jobs elsewhere. So they had to get a little more creative. But I also kind of think it's the way John Schneider operates and the way his brain works is they really aren't afraid to look anywhere or turn over any stone and look outside the lines. It's what brought Schneider to McDonald with no previous connections. It's what brought McDonald to many of his assistants who hadn't worked with him before. Ryan Grubb kind of fits that mold. They had met a year prior at the Combine and kind of stayed in touch, but they never worked together. They didn't really have any solid ties of guys that they both worked under or anything like that. And yet here we are with Ryan Grubb, a guy who's never coached a day in his life in the NFL, taking over the offensive coordinator duties. In that process that went on, I think, a lot longer than most of us wanted to. Fans want answers, and guys like you and I we just want answers so we can talk about it. That process went on for a while, and there were some ebbs and flows, and Grubb seemed like the front runner at first, and then it kind of seemed like they were going to go a different direction. Throughout the process, when it came time to name a guy, was Grubb kind of your first choice? Was he the guy you wanted, or was there another guy in the process that you were leaning towards before the final announcement was made?
I was intrigued by the idea of Tanner Engstrand, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was interesting to me, just his experience under Harbaugh. If you go back and be a sicko and look at his, FCS offense at San Diego, right? It's really physical, really heavy personnel. And then you go and see what he's done with the Lions and his kind of experience with that kind of drop back game, that drop back passing game, and how that would have blended. That seemed intriguing to me. Grubb, I really like the idea of. And why I like the idea is, wow, look what he did in college. But why I'm also liking the idea is a reason to be scared, which is it's ambitious in that, how does his offense translate from college to the NFL? Does it translate? Is it more, about actually kind of what he was able to do on a larger scale in college rather than the specific plays or the specific concepts? I imagine that's part of it. And when they went and did it, a bit like kind of Durde on the defense side of the ball as we spoke about, I think it's really kind of an ambitious, exciting young hire where they've gone, well, let's just get a guy who's really, seems to be a really good coach and has got a proven track record at every stop he's been at. And obviously in Grubb's case, he's been a very successful play caller, not just at Washington, but when DeBoer returned to Fresno State, he started doing really interesting things there as well.
And then he came out at his press conference a couple of days ago and talked a little bit about his philosophy, his plans. He used the term personnel-based scheme, and he talked a lot about how adaptable he is and how he would adapt what he did, what he has done, and what he will do to what he has on hand on the roster. And he has shown that kind of adaptability all throughout his career, even going all the way back to when he was offensive line coach at Eastern Michigan and some of the things he did there, and other times where he's had an opportunity to call plays, whether at the small school ranks or at Fresno. He has shown the ability to do the these that he said at his press conference he was going to do, which isn't always the case, right? We got a lot of promises from Shane Waldron and Pete Carroll while Waldron was here that we didn't necessarily see translate onto the field. Based on everything you've heard him say and what you've seen on tape, what are your expectations of what the offense is going to look like under him?
Well, I don't think it's going to look like, to your point about matching personnel, matching the situation, matching the kind of different world of the NFL where they're tied to hash marks and there's kind of different personnel getting out onto the field, slightly different defensive structures. Certain things are possible, certain things aren't possible compared to college. It's not going to be an exact match. I don't think it will be quite as vertical as Washington, but I think you're going to get his run game at Washington at times, particularly in 2022, also 2022, I guess, but they just didn't run the ball as much. But in 2022, they ran the ball a bit more, and it seemed very, very diverse. I think just like on a broad level, you just watch the tape, and there's very few kind of missed assignments. Everyone's doing a really good job of kind of executing their role on a given play. I don't think it's going to be as kind of vertical shots as they were able to do. But that is definitely an answer that he likes, the kind of, throwing like a slot fade or switch verticals. Obviously, when you have a Durde as your receiver, that helps. But then you're going to have DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett
and
too.
McMillan. Yeah.
Right. But you're going to have DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and Jackson Smith and Jigba and Jake Bobo, who Grubb actually offered.
You mentioned him, yeah.
Name. Right. So what it looks like in Seattle, I think it's a combination of what they did at Washington. I'm actually interested as well into how spread is this offense going to be, because at Washington it's pretty spread out. Even when there's one or two tight ends on the field, the receiver splits are quite spaced out. Obviously, the tie to hash marks the NFL, that isn't necessarily possible, but they lent quite a bit on empty formations. How much of that are they going to do, or are they going to be able to do? How much more under center do they feel compelled to use? And then how many of the kind of like pain in the butt formations for defenses that they're going to be able to run? Because in college, you can really get into like problematic looks when you align your formation into the short side. And while that's still a thing in the NFL, it's nowhere near as big a thing. But in college, every formation, and then a shift and then a motion, I'm like, wow, that's a real pain in the butt. In the NFL, it's still difficult, but I think it's more about the motion and the shifting that's going to be a really exciting thing. I think he'll find ways to make corners have to be in the run fit and make tackles. And I think the big factor will be how he overcomes what Shane Waldron struggled with at times, which was, Seattle has some decisions to make around their tight ends, but they've got a really good third receiver in Jackson Smith and Jigba. So good, in fact, that they picked him 20 overall. So good, in fact, that he could, in fact, be the number 2 wide receiver in Seattle, given, see how Tyler Lockett develops in terms of his career, his age. How does he get Jackson Smith and Jigba involved? But from what I saw of the Washington stuff, they do a bit of everything. It's more just that Michael Penix as a quarterback really likes the outside of the numbers stuff, so you naturally dial that up a bit more. And then the kind of areas where they may have been lacking, what I'm excited about in that sense is their assistant hires.
Yeah.
I mean, you go and get Jake Peets, who I know LSU fans aren't big on what he was doing, but he's had experience under, Sean McVay, which you're hired, but
right.
That, maybe it's not quite that
guys getting hired every year.
Right. Maybe not that simple, but he's going to be able to kind of continue. There's elements of McVay from Shane Waldron, but also there's a reason that a lot of teams in the NFL are looking for McVay coaches, because McVay's bootlegs concepts, but also his gun drop back game, it has been very, very impressive. And, there's a kind of crossover with what Grubb did occasionally with the gun drop back game, but, you kind of needed a bit of that. And then he goes and gets the guy as the quarterback's coach. Is it Charles London? Am I butchering?
I believe it is. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. As the quarterback's coach, right? And he was with the Titans and Arthur Smith. So that's quite exciting to me because that's quite an interesting offense in terms of how they target the short to intermediate levels, the kind of, again, the dig routes, the stuff that maybe you didn't quite see in Washington, and it's kind of more NFL-y. Not that what Washington did wasn't NFL-y, it's just so vertical and maybe not as much intermediate stuff. And the stuff which is intermediate is just basically a variant on, verticals or Y cross, but more kind of stuff designed to get to that numbers range or get a different type of route down the field open. More kind of the stuff that London and Pete's bring in is
a lot of new coaches. We got to try and keep.
I know it's an absolute mess, but they kind of bring in that NFL. We're running this primary stuff to get the intermediate open. So the other thing I wanted to say about Grubb is, they took shots and everything, But their offensive line, even if they're taking the shots, their offensive line didn't often feel that exposed. Like, he dressed it up well. That not bootleg stuff, but just straight play action, where it's just the quarterback dropping straight back, not rolling or anything, not moving the pocket. But they mixed up their protections really well to give the offensive line like good assignments and give Penix time to get those plays off. I felt it was very well married to what they had up front, because I mean, I could be off base, but I felt Washington's offensive line wasn't the best, particularly their offensive tackles, and yet they're still able to get the kind of the deep passing concepts going. And some of that also is it's a sideline shot, and to throw a sideline shot, actually, of all the deep passing plays, a sideline shot is the quickest to come out, because the guy's already there, right? He just has to run out of the field, and you throw it up, and there you go.
And you talk about adaptability, you talk about personnel-based scheme, and there are some who have tried to make the connection that, well, Geno Smith would fit well in a Ryan Grubb offense, because he's similar in style in some ways in how he can push the ball down the field to Michael Penix. But yet I think about like the year he got out of Jake Haener at Fresno State 3 years ago. He did it in a much different way. And go, for those of you listening and watching, go look at Jake Haener's numbers from his final year at Fresno State there. Or I don't think it was. I think he played 1 year after DeBoer left. He came out in the draft last year, went to New Orleans, but in a much different way, much more mobile guy, much smaller guy, and they would do some things with him to take advantage of that. But like, he's gotten similar production, massive numbers out of two very, very different quarterbacks at two different programs. I thought that was interesting. One criticism I hear over and over again, and I haven't broken down the tape. I've only watched Washington, just watched a bunch of games live, of course, living here in the area. And then as a WSU alum, I've watched what they've done to us the last couple of years. But some people have said, well, he doesn't like to use the middle of the field. But is that a Ryan Grubb thing? Is that a Michael Penix thing? Or is that just a case of he just had such dynamic weapons on the outside, and they were able to beat teams on the sidelines mostly, that's where they leaned into?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Again, you referenced the Fresno State stuff. I watched one. I only had all 22 for one of those games, which was the Oregon game, where Fresno State went really close against Oregon in 2021, and there's a bit more over the middle stuff. I think it's more just a Penix thing. But like I said, I think the way that they've hired these assistants kind of makes up for that too, along with, it's just the college hashes. Like, if they ever get one-on-one on the outside, you're getting the kind of ways of separating against one-on-one on the outside, which are going to go vertical outside the numbers, not over the middle. He's very, very good at getting route concepts called in, and with the details correctly executed to beat those coverages vertically outside. I don't know necessarily if he's had the kind of quarterback to throw in the intermediate over the middle areas, really. With Fresno State, they had mesh, but that's more kind of shallow intermediate, and not shallow intermediate, shallow over the middle. And really, when you throw that, it's more kind of going towards the sideline, like on the hashes, not on the middle, and on the college hashes, in fact. But yeah, I don't think it's a Grubb thing. That kind of seems like I don't think that's the right criticism. That's more kind of a criticism from what I've seen of Penix. There was a lot of plays where there's a guy actually over the middle who's kind of open, and Penix, he just goes for a sideline shot. And why wouldn't you when there's a guy out there? But also, there's kind of some separation over the middle at times. And Geno Smith, if you look at his heat map, there's certain areas of the middle of the field that he really likes targeting. Even if overall, perhaps Seattle's offense last year didn't go over the middle as much as like the heaviest NFL offenses targeting those areas.
We still don't know for sure and won't for a while if Geno Smith is going to be the guy or not. There are some who think that just because they let last Friday come and go without making a move, that he's a lock to be on the roster. It's that March 18th date that really might be a little bit more impactful with the roster bonus of almost $10 million coming due at that point. If he is still on the roster, if he is the starter opening day, are you intrigued? Are you excited? Are you curious about the match and what Ryan Grubb might be able to do for Geno Smith?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious because I think Geno's kind of a quarterback you can do anything with. The big question is the offensive line, which kind of brings us nicely to Scott Huff and the fact that he came with Ryan Grubb, and again, need to look at Washington. Is there something to, I don't know how good an offensive line coach he is. I need to study more at that kind of stuff and talk to more people about that. But just having the system familiarity, and like I mentioned, they had the offensive line to kind of hold up on the concepts they were running, right? It didn't appear like a massive liability when I was watching the games that I did. I watched the 2023 season and then a bit of 2022. But Geno's the 6th highest pressured quarterback in the league last year, despite his time to throw being only slightly slower than the average. There's all I wrote an article, SEAHAWKSOnTape.com, on the kind of data behind Geno Smith's 2023 decline in basic raw numbers. And really, the data shows that when Geno, after like a shaky first half, where there could be other reasons for that, and again comes back to a big part of that is better detailed coaching across the board from the offensive coaching staff being required, along with Geno having shaky games. Remember week 6 against Cincinnati? That was a really weird one. But in that last half of the season where he played well without pressure, and by the way, if you're being pressured, even plays when you're not pressured are going to be impacted because you're going to be a bit more skittish and have less faith in the pocket, and your offensive coordinator is going to have less faith in the plays they can call, right? Yeah. But the last half of the season, so when I say last half for Geno, that's his last 7 games versus his first 8, because he obviously missed 2 with injury. When he was pressured, he played pretty well as well. But on third down, even though Seattle's offensive line managed to improve kind of in the amount of pressure percentage they allowed overall, on third down, they allowed 51.3% of the third downs to be pressured, which is actually worse than the first 8 games of the season. So they, I wrote an article on it, but really, Geno would look good in this offense, yes, but the key for me is, can they protect for him? There's obviously some decisions they need to make on the interior of their offensive line. There's a growing question mark over the right tackle, which looked like, wow, you've hit in the draft, and now Abraham Lucas is dealing with that unfortunate knee thing, and you have to see if his operation that he underwent in the offseason kind of cleans itself up, and that does the job, right?
Right.
But
we don't even know what that is. I mean, all we have is just the cryptic Instagram post from Lucas himself showing himself in with an IV and a cap.
Right. He said when he came back that he'd take care of it in the off season. So he's done that. But So my personal belief is that they have to take care of the offensive line. And what Huff showed at Washington is, and he's described by McDonald as an offensive line guy at heart. I like how he's coached. As I throw a pen in excitement. I like how he's coached all parts of the offense, but he is an offensive line guy at heart. And as you referenced, his time as an offensive line coach, right? He showed that he's not leaving the offensive line out to dry. He's giving them kind of a variety of run concepts, and that it seems kind of well married. It doesn't seem disjointed. It just seems like it's suiting the offensive line. So that's encouraging for Seattle. I mean, because it's easy to rag on the offensive line. Like, easy to go, hey, they're not good enough. Why aren't they pass protecting? Why is Geno so pressured? Well, there's more that goes into it than that, right? There's so many different things that can influence, make the offensive line job even harder than it already is. And I think Seattle suffered from that on their offense last season. It wasn't just that, Anthony Bradford was thrown into action at right guard, to mention one name.
Did you have a chance to give a good look to the national championship game?
Not the All-22,
Okay.
because I need to find that. But
I ask because that's the one thing that gives some people pause. Like, hey, that Washington, that offense looked great all year, except for a couple of times, kind of Arizona State, the two Arizona schools kind of slowed them down a little bit. But Michigan pretty much kicked their butts all over the field and really beat up Michael Penix, got to him in a way that nobody else had throughout the year. And so there's some people who are thinking, I don't know, what was it that Michigan did to them to make it so hard on Ryan Grubb in that offense? And then, couldn't some of the teams in the NFL pattern themselves? It just, without the all-22, what do you think it was that kind of took the wind out of their sails in that game?
Well, I think Penix is some of Penix's limitations or areas he needs to improve on in the NFL was shown. Michigan did a great job disguising things. Michigan also, the other thing to that, I think Michigan dared Penix to throw the kind of over the middle stuff, which he kind of struggled with, right? And then it's a big question mark, really. That's a game that he'll have to answer for as well when it comes to this pre-draft process for him, right?
Yeah.
The other thing was Michigan's DBs did a really good job against the kind of slot fade routes, the kind of sideline routes where which Penix really likes hitting, and they just played with really good technique. And I think the biggest factor was Michigan just absolutely dominated Washington in the trenches. Just completely manhandled them. And that's always going to be tough. And, I talked about the offensive line, and I didn't think it was the best, but they did a good job marrying stuff. But this is the national championship. And while Texas, they were okay up front, but, in terms of their structure as well up front, you can maybe live with that a bit more kind of odd front looks and all that type of stuff, maybe 3-man rush going on. Michigan's just like, okay, we're gonna threaten pressure, similar to what Seattle's head coach is kind of bring in with the kind of Ravens thing. Jesse Minter doing a great job there this last season. We're gonna have some absolute dogs up front, and the Washington Huskies they struggle with that.
It's one of the most fascinating things I think about this staff as it's come together is that when you look at that game in particular is you had Ryan Grubb calling plays and you had him getting shut down by a defensive scheme that was installed by his boss now, and the guy that Seattle hired, like immovable force against it, whatever that cliche is, like what's gonna overcome, right?
Yeah. So what does that? I've been thinking about that a lot. Like, what does that say about how highly McDonald rates Grubb? That even with that, I will get the all-22. I just haven't yet, but I will get it.
I tend to think there has to be some sort of connection where Mike McDonald knew that whole staff at Michigan, clearly, obviously knows Jim Harbaugh well, worked for his brother and worked for him for a year. And so there had to be some indication, this is my opinion, that, Jim must have said to him, or Jesse Minter said to him, man, that offense was hard to prepare for. Like, we kicked their ass, but they were hard to prepare for. And
yeah, I mean,
there had to be some feedback along those lines.
It's like I said, all the kind of motions and the shifting and the formations they get into and the types of formations they get into are like just a pain in the ass to prepare for, right? Pain in the butt. And the kind of the other factor to that is they seem to just, watching them, they seem to not run many plays, but they have their kind of core concepts, which is something which they spoke about in the press conference, right? They have their core concepts, but then they seem to have a variety of looks they can get into that are very, very challenging for a defense. And then they'll shift into another very challenging look. And then they'll motion to widen someone out and make his job even more difficult. Yeah. I think it's that top part of it. And the fact that even against Michigan, I think their game plan was probably fine, like probably sound, but ultimately if you can't pass pro, if you got a banged up best running back, if you've got Penix struggling and putting hell, sure. There's other stuff going on. But I think to me, like the fact that McDonald was like, oh, he sucked against a similar defense to mine, and yet I see the vision and also I see his whole body of work. That is very exciting. And this is the hire. When McDonald was hired, right, he said about, it really stood out to me. He said, when he was asked about the Seahawks offense, he said he wants it to be similar to the defense in the kind of core concepts thing, right? And then he said, we want to build a system that's unique to the Seattle Seahawks that's going to live here for a long time. And who is going to be the one spearheading it? And I think Grubb is that type of guy who can come up with a pretty unique system. And what that might look like is a lot of kind of these disgusting spread style formations in the NFL and shifting and motion. And it was Andy Reid who said that the college is 5 years ahead of the NFL. No, don't get me wrong. We've seen guys like Cliff Kingsbury come into the NFL and try spread it out, but he was quite static still and pretty obvious and borderline kind of gimmicky or gadgety, right? And super air raid to start off with, and then just kind of uninspiring. But I think Grubb, the vision, along with those assistants that we've talked about, it's so ambitious because I think he can do a lot of stuff, and it's going to be really difficult for defenses. And he'll also understand, you would hope, how to deploy the Metcalf, Lockett, Smith and Jigba trilogy. Even though skill set wise, as what Waldron showed, as I've talked about, that is that there's some challenges there. But I'm really excited to see how Grubb kind of how he deploys them, how he gets it done.
One of the most fascinating offenses or off seasons in a long time, maybe ever, for the Seahawks, because we have all the speculation and all these theories and things that we think we know about Mike Macdonald and Ryan Grubb and the rest of the staff, but we don't know what the roster looks like. We don't know how they're going to approach free agency in the draft and John Schneider's first year of really having sole ownership of all those responsibilities. It's so much to talk about. I could keep you here another hour, but I know it's late there, and the coffee's only going to last so long, right? So,
I should get another one.
We'll catch up again after the roster's more set when we get closer to training camp and kind of get some clues as to which direction they might be headed. But always love having your insight. Let people know about the Seattle Overload podcast and the other work that you do.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me. Always a good time. SeahawksOnTape.com is where I post kind of data film pieces on Seattle. Like I said, Geno Smith data kind of look was out, and I'm going to have a piece on the Ravens run defense, Dan, which the second half of the season was about as bad as Seattle.
Interesting. Okay.
That's so maybe the Seahawks defense, can they stop the run? The third time of asking. We'll have to find out.
Now I'm intrigued. I'm a little afraid, but I'll have to check that out.
There you go. And then, so that should be out by the time you're listening to this. The Seattle Overload podcast. And
on Twitter, what's your handle there?
At Matty F for Football Brown.
There you go. Maddie, as always, thanks for being on the show, man. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, Dan.
All right. If you've never checked out the Seattle Overload podcast, you definitely should. Griffin Sturgeon and Dane Gonzalez, also part of that three-headed monster over there. If you like X's and O's, I mean, they get into it. I have learned so much from listening to those guys. Every time one of them comes on the show, I learn something. And it also reminds me of what I don't know, which is why I like to have so many guests on this show. Brings the interviewer out in me, but also the curious student. And I always feel like I learn something from my guests when they come on the show, and hopefully you do too. And if you do and you like it, hit all those subscribe buttons and all that stuff. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, You can leave a review there as well. Some 5-star reviews came in over the weekend. Very, very much appreciate the support. I'm Dan. You can follow me on Twitter at Seahawks Forever. Dana O'Gorman will be joining me tomorrow to catch up with her for the first time officially since all of the coaching changeover has happened. My former Field Goals podcast host, and we did the PSF app thing last year as well. Always good to catch up with Dana. So check that out tomorrow. Until then, forever and always, go Hawks.